Well, here we are, Jim, at the end. The end of whatever the Netflix producers were allowed to make. The final episode of Mr. McMahon, the exciting new docuseries that's tearing things up. Apparently millions and millions of people are watching it. Those aren't all wrestling fans. And the last episode was the one, I guess you could say, was most damaging to Vince.
Well, when you started getting into the family dynamics and poor Shane, bless his little heart, and everything, and the again, in hindsight, in retrospect, a lot of things that Vince said that were just odd or maybe mildly creepy with whatever has come to light since then has gone into creepy overload, right? But I think that this one was worse. Episode 6, the finish, and boy howdy, talk about the end of the road, the end of the line. I mean, they could have really tried to bury Vince a lot harder than they tried to bury him if this is supposed to be a burial. And Bruce was highly perturbed about it. They could have tried a lot harder. Most of the burial comes from things that he either did as a person, did on television with double meaning, produced himself, and in hindsight, said here on a sit down.
You know, it's really interesting the things that Vince was saying about himself, not just here, but all throughout the series, because it's not like he went to a therapist and heard these things. It's almost like what he has convinced himself
yes,
are the rules of his life.
Or he's diagnosed himself. You know, my doctor I used to have till he got so fucking old that I didn't trust it anymore.
I have two computers in my head.
Let's say
an apple and an egg.
and an apple and a fucking orange, I think. But he had a sign on his wall said, "Do not confuse your Google search with my medical degree." And I think Vince has done, because he opened up talking about, you know, describing him the way he thinks somehow. I can't remember how they led to it, but he's like, I've got two computers running in my head, and maybe a third I could access if I wanted to. And it's like two brains. And it's hard for me to pay attention. Now, bingo, he's got something right there.
And one day I'll get a hold of Batman. Like, what kind of, he's talking like a supervillain in a DC comic.
Well, yeah, like he has the Professor X powers or whatever. But then the thing that he said, and I wrote it down in capital letters, they said, well, what is your other brain thinking about right now? And he said, oh, it's something sexual. And again, in hindsight, boy, howdy, but that wasn't the only time. There was another time in the close of this show or later on in the program where they were asking him to describe himself or his qualities or whatever. And he said, you know, one thing and the second thing. And then he said, sexually active.
Like anyone needed to know that. Yeah.
He's almost 80. Was it even on anyone's mind? He has to have people know that he can still do it. He's the genetic jackhammer. And it was like if you interviewed some author on a fucking television show. Well, I like to play tennis. I'm active in charitable causes, and I finger Dalmatians. What? It just, no, what? It didn't belong in that, right? Nobody was thinking in that direction. He's got to interject that subject into the conversation.
And by the way, because he doesn't come out in the interview and go, and by the way, I'm fucking around, we're supposed to believe he's sleeping with Linda? Right? Because, I mean,
well, yeah, but they weren't even ever in the same room together for the documentary on his fucking life.
Yeah.
They weren't even in the same house, he was in a warehouse in a ring, which apparently he was getting to those fucking shoots at midnight now, from what's come out.
From what you remember, when was Janelle Grant working there for WWF? What period of time was it?
Well, the lawsuit indicated, I think, that didn't she get hired on in 2019 and things blew up in 2021 and that's when she signed the deal or whatever. Was that?
When was this interview with Vince?
God damn, it was after that they started shooting stuff. The earliest date I saw was 2020 or 2021.
Right. So if they interviewed Vince, if that was one of the first things they shot, and I don't know the order of things, in 2020 or 2021, that shit was active. So when he's saying, I'm thinking about sexual things, based on his text messages that we've seen,
oh, Christ.
It could all be tied to this. We don't know the timeline. And, you know, you would almost think it's earlier, too, because they never actually say anything about the plastic surgery and the dye job and the mustache. But again, at a certain point, he completely changed his look. So there's like a break point right there.
Well, yes, because you see that, you know, he at one point looked like an older guy with the shorter grayish hair and blah, blah, blah. And his face was starting to droop a bit. And then he comes out looking like Snidely Whiplash out of nowhere. But also, when he was doing the sit down, apparently he was putting him off, talking about The Rock being late. He would make them wait for these interviews all day. He'd show up at like 11 o'clock at night. He'd go to get his hair and makeup done and come out in the exact same suit. So all those interviews that looks like he's in the same ring, in the same room, in the same suit on the same day. It was different interviews, but he looks exactly the same.
Like there's an evil genius to that. You know, you almost admire the commitment, but there needs to be some sort of commitment. What is an 80-year-old
man doing until 11 o'clock at night when he's supposed to show up at noon or whatever the fuck?
Again, I don't know the timeline, but we know who he was hanging out with. It was that physical therapist,
trainer person,
the doctor, the chef.
Thank you, doctor.
There was the chef.
Yeah, I wonder what the chef is cooking up these days.
And those two brothers. I mean, they're real brothers. I'm not trying to say anything else.
What? Oh, God damn it. But anyway, that's the way this episode started out. My other brain is thinking about sex. And then they pick up with WrestleMania 2007, the build and the whole 9 yards, the hair versus hair match, Battle of the Billionaires with Vince McMahon and Donald P. Trump. The P stands for pig shit. And they make the point that, again, you know, a lot of people, not just us, have been talking about. Bob Costas said Trump's persona is closer to wrestler than statesman. And the lady's name you were looking for is Sharon Mazer.
Yes.
Yes, you are correct.
I thought she was great. I thought she actually brought a seriousness, and everything she said was intelligent and right.
And she said Trump is an example of the pro-wrestlingification of American politics. And they were showing the clips, and Uncle Dave mentioned similarities between Trump and Vince, as I have. Except that, you know, Vince, until he went mad, is more polished and groomed and articulate.
Hearing some of the stories in this documentary, it lends to more comparisons. Just the idea that Vince could never lose. He'll cheat no matter what, even with his son wrestling. You know, he'll tell him, I'll cheat. I'm going to win.
And what was it that married Trump? President Pigshit's niece. She's a clinical psychologist, and she's been campaigning to tell the world not to fucking trust this lunatic with anything. She said a lot of this strife that the country and the world has gone through with my uncle could have been averted if his father had ever been able to bring himself to tell him he loved him. And what's the theme here?
And they both went to military school. And again, Trump won't accept losing. Vince, in his own words, unless I'm dead, I win.
Yeah.
Like, that's his attitude. And, you know, when you really think about it, you didn't get a lot, but the little bit you got from Vince about Vince was illuminating. Especially this, again, for no reason at all. And again, they didn't know how they were going to edit it. They didn't know that this big thing was going to break wide open and send Vince into the nether. But they open it with this comment about him thinking about sexual things. So it certainly sets the tone.
And then they went past the WrestleMania hair versus hair, blah, 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 to go into, and I had forgotten about this. It was 2007, right? Where they pitched Vince some kind of idea, and he said, no. What about if somebody kills me? And they blew him up in the fucking limousine. I had forgotten about that because of what happened less than a week later, where they had to come out and he came out and said, well, last week that was phony. I'm okay. That's all. But Chris Benoit's dead. And here we go with that. And then he gets a whole nother chance to look like an asshole in front of every news and sports interviewer in the world.
And I guess the rumor was if the Benoit murder suicide hadn't happened, they were going to do a whole thing, and Rod McMahon was actually going to appear on TV, the real guy, the real brother of Vince McMahon.
Yeah.
And it never happened. And that episode was one of the more surreal episodes of Raw ever. For the William Regal statement, which stood out at the time because he didn't say much, but it made it sound like it was a lot darker than we were led to believe. And then the graphic at the bottom with the three of them when it just went away. It was like the whole thing. It was a crazy night. That was a crazy night.
And obviously that's been documented, with what happened there. But the point was that they did that show. And where was it? Either just practically at the same time that the show was rolling, they were starting to find out whatever the fuck was going on. And there was chaos. But that's when everybody started talking about steroids and roid rage and bringing that whole thing back up. And Vince immediately, starts going on the defensive and blah, blah, blah. But when Chris Nowinski got involved, don't remember because we weren't doing this then, but at the time I said roid rage doesn't last for days or hours or, the whole thing as we started to get details. But then Nowinski stepped in with CTE, and Vince was here today kind of scoffing at CTE, at brain damage.
At what he may have.
It probably what is, nobody will ever examine that brain. I'm sure the family won't allow it. But you've got to think that there's something fucking going on at this point with his age and the late in life trauma.
Bumps after 50. All of his bumps are after the age of 50, right?
Yes. And chair shots. And I would say stunners, but he never took a good stunner. So.
And then Steve Austin, that was a surprise too, to hear that he doesn't believe in CTE. I guess that's the way to say it. He doesn't believe that CTE is a real thing.
He never actually came out and said the words, I do not believe in CTE, but he said, concussions, I don't know, if you're getting a lot of concussions just wrestling, you're not doing it right. Hey, yeah, you still kind of can. That was disheartening, but anyway, so then the problem was they brought Nowinski in to explain what CTE is, and that in 2007 nobody really knew, but they were starting to find out. And Benoit's brain was the worst they'd ever examined. And then Vince admits, we brought Chris in. He's just scoffed at it, but we brought Chris in and eliminated headshots and financially supported Chris's research on something he had just scoffed at. Did that make a lot of sense to the average person?
Remember when Vince and Linda separately testified? They gave testimony before, was it Henry Waxman?
I think so.
It was a committee.
Congressional committee.
And I think Linda talked about how they cleaned up things. Maybe it was Stephanie, but how they cleaned up things for the betterment of the wrestlers. And then Vince said, it was all for PR.
Yeah.
He said that. It was like, no, I think it's all crap. It's all for PR. I'm just doing this for good PR. That's the other thing, too. if you love steroids and you advocate for them, or at least you're going to do them for yourself, defend them already. He never just gave a defense for using them. Instead, it would be defending people being upset that he used them.
You know what they never went into this entire time? They showed some footage of him working out with, could that have been the personal trainer?
I think that's who that was, yeah.
But in as B-roll, in passing, they never went into his obsession with bodybuilding. What was he, 72? He was on the cover of Muscle and Fitness or some advanced age.
Something like that, yeah.
And for a billionaire, for the head of a major corporation, that's very unusual. For anybody in business to still keep that body and that workout regimen at that age is not unique, but bordering on that. And they never even went into it. What is the mindset there? Is that how he works out more of his mental computers? I don't, but they didn't go into that, did they?
No, nothing really about his schedule at all.
Well, and again, then they were in the middle of his schedule. He's walking in. Vince was always a workaholic when I knew him and when I worked with him, worked for him, whatever. But he was never 11 hours late for anything, and you didn't start shit at midnight. You were still doing the shit you started at that fucking late afternoon. But I don't know what's happened to him.
Was he always on time?
Yes, unless he was always on time for a production meeting or a show or an important meeting or something that he had called, but you could wait for hours at his house while he was on the phone, or if you were trying to get in just for something you needed, he was tied up endlessly. So yes and no, but I never remember anything like, we're waiting for Vince at the studio at noon and he's not there till fucking almost midnight or whatever.
What do you think of, I mean, you mentioned that he did it, but what do you think of the idea that he every time got in makeup and in the exact same suit so it looked like one endless session?
Well, I mean, if you're doing television where it's a television program and it's going to be post-produced, you kind of want the announcers to be wearing the same thing at the beginning or the end, or the talent to wear, to match what you're doing. But it's obvious that this was a multi-part series conducted over the course of, well, I guess a couple of years from start to finish. But, so I don't know what he was doing there. Because at some point they would want you to change up, I would think. I can understand the guys that they did one long sit down with. Hulk Hogan will go to Tampa. We'll sit down and but the subject is usually seen in a variety of different places, right?
Except Dave Meltzer. He too, when they brought him back like in 2024, it was like the same, not his office, and his hair color was as dark as it was the first time.
Well, I'm thinking that they probably couldn't fucking get a crew into his office from the pictures we've seen of it, with all the stuff hanging up, or sitting around on the floor. But nevertheless,
nothing in Vince's office. Do you think that's like a Vince thing? Like, I want to be shot in a ring in a dirty room? Like, what was that look there?
Again, it was kind of artsy. And I didn't mind it, the ringmaster of this whole thing being shot in the, but at some point, why didn't they go to his office? Or why didn't they go to what is his house now? He doesn't have the old place I used to go to, but his condo. Or does he have a billiard room that you could shot a fucking Vince shooting a goddamn 8-ball? I don't, he was, it was like he was being interrogated rather than interviewed for a documentary. But that's what did Triple H say? You see what he wants you to see, right? And Anyway,
Yeah, I mean, again, you go to his philosophy, don't sell anything. Like everyone said that about him. His whole thing is don't sell anything.
yeah.
His whole life is a lie.
My whole life is a lie.
Don't do that with a Southern accent. He'll get mad.
Hey, I'm telling you. So where were we in this thing anyway?
What is his accent? That's never really discussed. He grew up in North Carolina. He doesn't sound in any way Southern. Is that because he practiced to have like a neutral sounding middle America voice? Like, what is that?
Well, here's another thing. Even though this was not made clear. He meets his father when he's 12 years old and I think the book Ringmaster may have gone into more detail, but I can't quote it chapter and verse right here and right now.
Yeah, he would visit.
But he would only visit. He was still going back and forth. So do you think when he started being the announcer back in 1972, do you think he adopted that tone so that it could help hide his twang?
Like Linda, you could hear a little bit. You could hear it in her voice. You don't hear anything in his.
Well, maybe because he has no soul.
Wow, you've now come to my side. Welcome to the team, Jim.
But anyway, and then they spotlighted the wrestler starting to die young as a natural segue from Benoit. And okay, of course, there's Vince say, well, a lot of these guys, they abuse the pills for fun, and blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, they added more testing and they added the rehab and they added the medical. And as we've said before, the drug testing was not a byproduct may have been saving some guys from themselves, but it was so we don't make investments in these fucking guys, and either then they can't, fulfill their obligations or they get on the front page of the paper. And rehab was more of a PR stunt because they still didn't provide medical. If you got cancer, you're on your own. But if you have a substance issue, they'll send you 17 times. And they added a lot of the medical testing, but again, to make sure nobody had a fucking stroke or a heart attack as best they could prevent, while they were on the roster. So a lot of this was best for business in one way or another, either the business or the PR of the business. It wasn't just, the beneficent, magnificent McMahon, deciding to spread the wealth around. Am I being too cynical?
No. I think you have to apply a lot of cynicism to Vince McMahon.
And then
he's a wrestling promoter.
Well, that's true. But then here was the thing again, an Undertaker. Undertaker, who's at one point in the series said, I would take a bullet for that man, talking about Vince. But I was surprised they covered it, but it was kind of a big deal that Vince walked into WrestleMania 2014 and decided, well, we're going to end the streak. And remember, everybody was up in arms about that, and that was quite the topic. But that's also where Taker said he got the concussion, and he said, to this day, I can't remember the rest of that match. And Undertaker is not Hulk Hogan. Undertaker is not going to just make shit up out of his ass to tell you because it's a good story for whoever he's talking to. If he tells you he got his bell rung and can't remember the match, he can't remember the fucking match. Because he's not usually one to admit weakness. And then Vince said, well, I think maybe he can't remember it because he was upset over doing the job. How the fuck couldn't Vince come out and just say, oh, boy, Taker really gutted through it that day, but he is upset about doing the job. What? He's done jobs before. He remembers the match.
Because that's how Vince McMahon in real life treats a real life job. It never happened. I didn't lose. It never happened. He can't even fathom what it would be like. It would be like getting concussed to admit you lost to Brock Lesnar. I don't know what the hell that argument was. And again, it all goes back to, I mean, the one thing never really explored anywhere, not in this documentary, not anywhere, is the Vince McMahon-Brock Lesnar relationship. Like, now you really have to question, what was their friendship?
Well, yeah, because again, and they revealed in one of the graphics updated here later on when they get into that, that, Brock was the unnamed person in the lawsuit that had, come out a while back when we talked about it, when it came out. But how did that, how would you start that fucking, Brock is such a grumpy, antisocial fuck to begin with, and Vince is this old, goddamn silent movie villain looking motherfucker. And I'm just trying to think in the rooms, hey, Brock, I got something for you. What?
Again, Sable sued Vince for sexual harassment or whatever it was, and then Brock married Sable.
Yes.
And then Vince and Brock would get together and share nudes on their phone. I don't know how this worked.
It don't add up.
Should I swipe left or right? What do I do?
He's probably still asking for Polaroids. But anyway, and that's, conveniently next in the program, they moved to the PG era because of all the salaciousness and salicity and all that stuff. And they got more sponsors, but they got silly and they lost a lot of their fans. Imagine that. And that's where they went in a slump as far as viewership and whatever. Because but that's when silly Vince was able to come to the fore again, because now, if it's PG or whatever, that's where we got silly gimmicks and silly Vince. And half the show, also the women's evolution, half the show being women. So with what they had said previously in this very documentary about the primary audience of the Attitude Era, the reason it was hot, these young men, 18 to fucking who knows what the fuck. Testosterone-driven entertainment. And then suddenly they give them PG, kiddie gimmicks, and half the show is women fighting. I'm surprised they didn't lose more than 75% of the fucking Attitude Era audience.
And considering the success recently, it goes to the argument that people weren't necessarily sick of WWE, they were sick of Vince McMahon's WWE.
Yes. And because now, even though it's not R-rated, I never said during the Attitude Era, we didn't need the majority of the language and the boobies and all that stuff. Let Austin cuss. Let Austin do the finger. Let, whatever, a few people, but we didn't need most of it. But now that they're doing the WWE for at least adults with logical minds, and they don't have to strip down and have the Tijuana Donkey Show. Because it's adult people, more contemporary. They're athletes. They're superstars. But they're not gobbledygookers. Anywho, but they suffered through that. And then the Shane segment. And again, it goes back to so-and-so, fill in the blank, could have been averted if only his father had told him he loved him. There's fucking Shane out there, and you said that he became your favorite McMahon the way he came off in this thing, and this was the biggest segment for that, is that he got emotional. When he talked about his big return to the company in 2016, he got the big ovation, the crowd cheered for him. And his match with Undertaker at Mania, his match with Kurt Angle, where Angle threw him through 15 windows or whatever. The crazy bumps, the diving off the Titantron, the elbow through the table. He was trying to prove himself to his dad. Another generation was repeating different context, different time, different people, but repeating the same general fucking motif. And then they actually get a camera shot of Vince actually hugging him and patting him on the back. He looked as awkward doing that in some ways as when Trump held the Bible up in the photo op. But Shane was 50 fucking years old there at that point, and that was a big deal for him to get a hug and a pat on the back from Vince. And do you hear the sirens in the back, by the way? We're finishing this, folks, right before the hurricane comes through Kentucky.
I don't hear the sirens, no.
Well, they went by. I don't know what's going on out there.
All right, you're hearing things, Vince. What I was going to say is, I think Shane could at least know that from everything I've ever heard about him, and especially recently, he's a better guy than his dad. And he is maybe more conscious of all the issues and how not healthy they are for family. And I'm sure based on, what we hear and what we know, that Shane's probably been a very different kind of dad to his kids. It seems like Shane's got his shit together. Shane was terribly impressive here and someone you ended up rooting for in this thing.
Yeah, well, you saw he brought his 3 boys out on the rampway when they had the clip of the WrestleMania thing. And he had them when I was down there again. And last time I saw him was the Hall of Fame in 2017. He had his kids with him. He was hugging them and they were toddling around. I don't know how old they were, whatever the fuck. And it's a completely different. I can't see Vince doing that with it. I'm trying to think, when have I ever seen Vince around a child? Because I left Connecticut right about the time that I think Shane was the first one to have a grandson, wasn't he? Before Stephanie,
I believe so. Did anyone ever bring kids to the office? Not in the family, but just people who worked in the office?
I don't remember that. I don't remember ever seeing a child in the office. I don't ever remember seeing a child in the room with Vince McMahon. I don't know how he would have reacted just to a random child. Would he go, "Oh, hey, how you doing, pal?" Or would he,
well, yeah, by the way, we're not talking about Shane with random people. We're talking about his actual kids. So we were talking about Vince and kids.
Yeah, but no, I'm just talking about Vince McMahon and a child. I'm trying to think of, like, would Vince have ever played Santa Claus at the office Christmas party or the kid? No, just Vince McMahon interacting with a child. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that happen.
And obviously, we didn't get too much about Grandpa Vince in this. That's another area of his personal life. We didn't find out one thing one way or another here.
Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, they had footage of Vince working out and working, and then the sit-down interview. And they B-rolled a few pictures of, like, 3 vacations he's taken in his life. And so you got no interaction with any of his family, actually shot just for this. And then, but speaking of family, then they had the lineup of all the guys talking about how Vince was like a father figure. And advisor, mentor, I can buy, but no, not father figure.
I mean, that's the other thing. Or any of these guys that didn't have, I've seen some of their biographies before. Like Steve Austin's dad was around, I think. The Undertaker's, like, it wasn't like they didn't have dads. Like, there was no one, and all of a sudden there was this nice, benevolent Daddy Warbucks throwing money around to take bumps.
I didn't have a father figure and didn't see Vince as a father figure.
It's so weird.
And I mean, that's not to say you can't learn from him, but
is that something?
Like I said, I learned business stuff, but I didn't learn any of the life lessons. I didn't like the life lessons that he tried to learn you.
Is it something you think Vince tried to cultivate? He wanted that sort of relationship, not 2 friends, but, think of me as a father figure.
Probably, because that would make it easier, not only to work with them as your main event guys on a daily and weekly basis, but also for negotiations over finishes or anything else. I'm sure it was, but and I wonder how Shane feels like when when he sees all these other guys. Well, I feel like he's a father figure, and he's the one he's trying to do all this shit to get Vince's approval to begin with, and everybody else, oh, we love Vince. He's like a father. And that's what did Tony Atlas say? He said the reason why that it went to Stephanie, or ultimately with the sale now, which nobody could have predicted a few years ago, no McMahon is running the company, but it was going to go to Stephanie rather than Shane, because Tony said Shane is too nice of a guy, but you can't take advantage of Stephanie. Which is another way to say it, but she's a real bitch. So was that it at the ultimately? Did Vince say, well, Shane's too nice of a guy for this? That's Stephanie. She's a real cutthroat.
Well, I think Stephanie was definitely the one we always heard was more like Vince. And with Shane, I mean, that Paul Heyman story kind of spells it out for you. He was very hard on Shane because I think in Vince's head, he's made everything where he took over from his dad a lot harder than it ever was. And, Shane wanted to do anything. Shane had to step over his dad to do it.
Well, and I mean, allowing...
For no good reason.
But allowing that it's Heyman that told the story.
That was a hell of a story for Heyman to tell in his documentary.
Well, yeah, and I'm saying allowing it's Heyman telling a story. I'm sure it wasn't delivered possibly in as much detail or with the dramatic inflections or whatever, but I can see, Vince doing something like that. And for those of you who hadn't seen it yet or didn't see it or whatever, Shane is wanting something and Vince is saying no, and Shane won't give up. And we all been there. And finally Vince says, he takes a knife from the table or whatever, and he says, here, plunge this into my heart. Because that's the only way you're ever going to get it. If you can make the decision, that's the only way you're ever going to get it over my dead body. Just if you're not man enough to do it, then I'll take that into consideration too. Of course, Heyman said it much more floridly and verbosely and dramatically. But the point is there, is like at some point you think that it's like living in goddamn Game of Thrones. And that's what, it was. It was. And it was basically Vince and Stephanie and Triple H through, what do the kids call it now? The 20 teens or the 2010s or that era where, they were the top three people in charge and Vince was undoubtedly number one of that three. But it looked like then they were winding this show up and they had about 30 minutes left. And I said, oh, apparently they're going to give us an update at the end of the program. And that's where they were leaving it was Vince didn't want to retire. He said, when you stop growing, you die. Well, okay, I don't understand people that want to do that. Well, go die then. That's his attitude. If you've dug a ditch for 50 fucking years, you want to stop digging the fucking ditch? No, fuck you. So everybody in the whole thing said, oh no, he won't retire. He'll never retire. It'll be a nuclear bomb when he retires.
Hulk Hogan said there would be no WWE without Vince McMahon.
Yeah. And then they cut to in June of 2022, Vince McMahon stepping down. Hush money, anonymous email to the board of directors. And the whole cover-up was exposed. And then at that point, the story that we've covered from then to date began unfolding, and Vince canceled all future interviews with these fine representatives of Netflix. So then they went back, and since I guess he wouldn't talk to them, in modern times, they showed many, many clips of Mr. McMahon being a dirty pervert on Raw. Holy fuck. I mean, at the time he was doing it, And being around him, even though I wasn't around at that point in time where he was doing a lot of that stuff, I was safely home in Louisville, minding my own business, literally. I always took it because he wanted everybody to know that he was genetically potent or whatever. That he's a man's man. But again, with hindsight, going back and looking at all that stuff, you're like, oh Christ. And they talked about the tanning salon, and then more NDAs and payments being uncovered, and Vince retiring, and then Vince coming back, and Stephanie quitting, and Vince wanting to sell. And that's when they brought Bruce back in. Again, we alluded to it, I think, earlier, but
what was that? First of all, what did Bruce see? 'Cause we'll talk about it, but Bruce reacts to whatever they have sent him, whatever he has seen. So we don't know what cut that is, and we don't know what that includes. Is it everything up until this point? We don't know.
Well, and also he said, I don't know what because they brought up what Meltzer had to say with Shoemaker. Well, I don't know what happened, anything with Shoemaker and Meltzer and their lies and blah, blah, blah. But this was in January 2024, I believe they identified, and they asked him, well, what did you think of the rough cut or the early drafts or however they phrased it, whatever they showed him? Well, I think they sucked. I think they sucked. It wasn't fair and balanced. He says like he's on Fox News. It was a gotcha piece.
How?
And hold on. He said, you sat down to think, how can we make Vincent K. McMahon look shitty, right? Missing the human side. No shit. Because is there a human side of him? If he would show it to someone, we'd know it was there. Now, I have to, in all fairness, and Bruce told a story, and it does mean a lot to him. And I'm not jacking around here. I'm not making fun of anything or whatever. Bruce's wife, Stephanie, did get cancer years and years ago. It's like, I think almost 25 years ago. And Vince helped him out there and made sure that she had the best care. And he told that story. And that is true. And it means a lot to him as it would to anybody. I've told in the past, when I first moved up there to work in the office, my credit was not the best from Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And the only house that I could find within a 40-mile radius of the office that with air conditioning in it, that I could afford to rent, laughingly afford to rent, was $2,000 a month in 1996. Because of Connecticut, need I say more? And we basically found the one that I wanted, but I couldn't. The landlord, another issue, was a pain in the ass. But anyway, Vince said, how's the house thing coming? I found one, but, she doesn't like my credit. Well, just pay the rent in advance. Fuck, it's $2,000 a month. He advanced me $25,000 to pay for the house in advance so I could live in the house I wanted to live in. Took it out every week, but with no interest. But he's not a complete, absolute asshole to everybody. Vince McMahon is capable of doing good things for people. However,
if they benefit his business.
Well, and that's the thing. There has to be some, connection there. But having said that, Bruce said it was how can we make Vince look shitty? Phil Mushnick can figure out ways to sit down and try to make Vince McMahon look shitty. This series was not it. A lot of this was the shit Vince has done, making Vince look shitty.
Yeah, and up to that point, what would Bruce be reacting to? Dave Meltzer revealing that Vince had been lying about the WrestleMania 3 stats? That Hulk Hogan had ratted out Jesse Ventura? The Vince and Shane stuff? mentioning the Benoit stuff, mentioning the Owen stuff. These things can't be ignored. In what way has this been a hit piece in any way? In what way in any way has this been a hit piece?
Yeah, I didn't see it. And because nobody came out and flat out said in this entire series that the time period that Vince, and a few people have said this to me privately, the time period that Vince started becoming more and more willing to act out on some of his stranger instincts was when he became a billionaire after the stock sale and they got a plane, and boy, howdy, there ain't no stopping us now.
Yeah, and there's still stories that we've heard about that plane that have not gone out, not been public. So you got to think there's still a lot more stories out there.
Well, I think probably a couple of the miscellaneous NDAs had the airplane involved. That's why we don't hear a lot about that either. But
that's the sad, unspoken thing about women's wrestling in North America. We went from not having it really at all except for a novelty match, or if there was a champion and one challenger, not a division, to the shows being loaded up with women. And maybe the largest reason for that was Vince McMahon just wanted a lot of women around, and he was sexually harassing some of them. Like that's the hard reality of the evolution of women's wrestling up until Vince McMahon left. You know, I think a lot of people have to face up to facts about that, because we have an overabundance of women's wrestling now, and it's a lot more serious than it was, but it's still too much because the floodgates were opened at some point by Vince.
Well, speaking of the floodgates of Vince, they were opened up when the Grant lawsuit was revealed. And then all the gory details start coming out, and Vince resigned from everything because he had come back. They covered that he came back, didn't really, kind of glossed over. Basically, he came back to sell it, and he did sell it, right? There was a lot more there, but again, fucking thing was already pretty long.
Hey, when Bruce was talking, do you think those were Bruce's words? Or was Bruce speaking on behalf of Vince? Because everyone knows, it's not a secret, Bruce is Vince's mouthpiece.
Avatar?
Rhonda said Avatar. That's not far off. I mean, even still, I know he's there and playing nice, but that's why you can never completely count out the idea that Vince has any influence. Bruce being there, Bruce is Vince's guy. And Bruce defended what was...
He was in the golf cart when they were running around in the back of the arena. He's in the golf cart behind Vince.
But he's the one defending vociferously what wasn't really a hit piece. Whose words do you think those were his or Vince's?
Well, it's hard to tell because Bruce has been around Vince for so long, and I'm not even saying this as a joke. Bruce uses a lot of the terminology, phrases of speech, patterns of speech, whatever that Vince uses, because he's been around him for so long. So that sounds like, not being fair and balanced, a gotcha piece. How can we make Vince look shitty? That sounds like something that Vince would describe or would say in his own words, but it also sounds like something Bruce would say in his own words, because his own words often sound a lot like Vince's.
Where was the gotcha part, though?
I don't know, because we knew all this shit. It just...
Yeah, you couldn't ignore it.
The gotcha part was seeing it all A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and together in a close period of time where you're like, boy, howdy, he's been in a lot of fucking various strife in his life. That was the only gotcha. There was no other gotcha. We already got it. We remember it now more vividly that you reminded us, but we already knew.
And again, Bruce Pritchard doing that interview in 2024, having a problem with how Vince McMahon was portrayed in this documentary. That was Bruce as a WWE executive. That wasn't Bruce the citizen. That's Bruce as an executive.
Bruce the citizen. Citizen Bruce. Citizen Bruce, baby. I'm telling you, hey, that could be a better gimmick than Brother Love. If he just came out and did a weekly dissertation on the state of America, Citizen Bruce.
It would be about as over as Brother Love wasn't.
Well, we can all hope. So, anyway, the the end of this thing finally came. Vince resigned from everything, sold most of his stock, and has made $2 billion. And nobody asked what the $2 billion in cash that he's got in the last year or whatever is where that currently resides or what's being done with it.
The Cayman Islands. I save puppies. Wasn't that the story that he was going to the Cayman Islands or he was going to Cancun, wherever it was, and he was rescuing puppies and kittens and bringing them back? And then we find out he just fired his PR firm because that was their strategy. Let's make Vince the animal saver. That really didn't work. It hasn't really done anything to help his reputation.
The thing is, I don't know whether he was doing it or whether he just did it. Whether he was there and he brought some back. I don't know whether he was going back and forth and bringing more. That would have been a rib if they'd have talked to him. Yeah, just make several trips down there and back with the puppies.
I've become a smuggler. He looks like a smuggler now with the mustache and the black hair. If he wore like an Indiana Jones hat.
I think I swear he needs to get the little devil goatee and he'd have it. But that's it. I don't know if it was telling or just, it was funny as fuck to me when they asked Undertaker, Trish Stratus, Booker T, John Cena. They all asked the same question. What is Vince McMahon's legacy? And it was,
and that was before
had an answer.
And that was before the scandals.
Yes.
Right? Those interviews were predominantly before the scandals.
And Tony Atlas immediately came out with greatest promoter of all time. Well, then that may be arguable with P.T. Barnum and Don King or whatever, but at least, he came out with something, but everybody else that knows him even better is like, humana. And then Vince, they asked him and not only didn't he really give an answer, he went off, he gave an answer, but it had nothing to do with his legacy. And he went off on the point that he'd been making that he put out in the statement when he had seen the rough cut of this, that a lot of people confuse me with my character, Mr. McMahon. But then the more he talked, by the time he was finished, he went into, some people become the character and they can't tell the difference. With me, it's a blend. One is exaggerated. I'm not sure which one. He should have been a weatherman because he could do the forecast. It's either going to rain or it's not. But yeah, so Vince is...
A lot of weird quotes for no reason from him. That one, the one about Rita Chatterton saying he denied it. And then he said, even if it did happen, the statute of
limitations ran out. So is Vince another guy like Trump that his own attorneys would not want him to be deposed?
I think that's a difference between Vince and Trump. Vince seems to listen to his attorneys. I mean, he only had one, and he listened to Jerry McDevitt for years.
Yeah.
I mean, he had more than one. He had a team, but Jerry was the main guy. I don't know who he has now. Things fell apart once Jerry announced that he was going to start retiring, and then all the shit hit the fan. The big one finally came. He was on the way out.
And he probably thought, I ducked that just in the nick of time.
You wonder, there's a lot of unanswered questions about the past. We've talked about some of those as childhood. But in terms of the present, it doesn't really clarify if Vince has a relationship with everyone in his family. It alludes to the fact that Stephanie was the one that told him to leave. There's a lot that you come out of this knowing nothing. Do you think they're going to do more? Are they going to bring this back once the trial starts or something?
Bring it back, the return, the trial of Billy Jack followed by the trial of Vince McMahon. I don't know that. I don't think they can bring it back. I think they've done it now. Maybe there's a special 1 hour update at some point in the future, but I don't even know if it would be a part. It wouldn't be a part of this particular series. It'd just be another standalone thing they do. But
I'd like to see a real good documentary filmmaker make a documentary about Vince McMahon, and not this. Nothing with cooperation from anyone. Just tell the story in 2.5 hours.
And what is, well, that may be asking too much, but what, like you said, what is the relationship? Does he see the grandkids? What's Christmas like?
Him and Linda.
Now that there's been all this family strife.
Yeah, him and Linda. What's his relationship with Stephanie? What's his relationship with Triple H? Him and Shane. They never resolve where they are today. Any of the wrestlers and him today. Like, nothing is really... It was like they rushed... To me, the 6th episode was like the last season of Game of Thrones. Like, how do we get like 3 seasons worth of stuff into 1 season? And they jammed a bunch of stuff. They didn't have an ending, obviously.
Well, that's why I said they were winding up with a half an hour to go, and it looks like they probably would have, padded 10 minutes and said, fuck it, but they had all the new news, so instead they did 30 minutes on what they could have done another 2 episodes on.
I guess if you took all the Vince McMahon interview clips and put them all together, there was not necessarily new information, but new insight into how he, at least in front of the camera, says he thinks about things. And you have to wonder if that's the truth. Or are we saying that for some twisted performance,
I think that, well, again, he sees what you want him to see, was the quote. And normally he's so careful when he speaks. And of course, a few times he has gotten pissed. They showed the clip where I'd forgotten about again, where he slapped the clipboard or the notebook out of the reporter's hand and he jousted with Bob Costas and whatever. But in this one, I think him being old and not being accustomed to this form of long-form sit-down interview talking about himself as a subject, and knowing in his mind that a lot of people didn't know about a lot of the shit they didn't know about when he was talking, that he said a few things that, like, yeah, I'm thinking about sex and I'm sexually active and the stuff about he and his father, maybe every once in a while, he and Shane, those telling little lines, he may not have said that if it hadn't been whatever it was, midnight or 1 a.m, and all those conditions I just mentioned had been prevailing. He might not have opened up in that respect enough where you could hear that and guess things. Because remember, he's never talked about himself.
Yeah, you wish there was a project like this around him in the late 90s or something, where he was younger, maybe had more to say, maybe remembered more. But we get it now, and it's old man Vince, it's forgetful Vince, it's late night Vince, and maybe criminal Vince. We'll find out.
Yeah, and at least criminally creepy Vince. Ugh. But that was that series.
Any closing thoughts on the series and on the state of Vince McMahon, the McMahons, and WWE?
Well, there are none except for Triple H by marriage, and I think it's probably going to stay that way. And I'm glad that Triple H didn't get too much on him in this series, so that he can continue doing what he's doing, because he's doing a good job. But yeah, I don't see any of the other. Stephanie got the introduction at Mania and has waved at the crowd a few times, but I think that's kind of the extent it's going to be. And does she want to do any more now? So I think the McMahon era is pretty much over with.
And with Shane McMahon, when people talk about the rumors about him doing something with AEW with Tony Khan, you could understand from his perspective how he has unfinished business with professional wrestling. He still wants to do something. I don't know what it would be.
Nah.
And I'm not saying it would be that. But I am saying that it may not be easy to go back to WWE to do something. We don't know. So you could understand why, no one really could leave wrestling either as a fan or someone who's in the business, with the exception of like Mark Lewin or something. No one ever completely gets away and stops thinking about it.
Jack Briscoe. He's my hero. Just fuck it. Gerald, I'm going back in that terminal, and the next thing headed south, smoking, I'm going to be on it. That's the way to retire. But anyway, can we retire?